Welcome, everyone. Welcome, everyone. We're going to go live on YouTube in a moment. So we're just waiting for a moment for it to sync. Good to see you all. Good evening, everyone. Welcome. My name is Jennifer Scapitone, and with Hans Saucy, whom I'll introduce in a moment, I've been fortunate enough to be able to convene this winter's series of 4 colloquia devoted to exploratory translation happening in some University of Chicago quadrant of the virtual realm, occupying nonetheless in various material forms the traditional unceded lands of the Council of the Three Fires, the Ojibwe, Odawa, and Potawatomi nations. I'm tuning in from the shoreline of Lake Michigan, a name derived from the Ojibwe word Mishigama, meaning great water. Other tribes that called this place home include the Miami, Ho-Chunk, Menominee, Sac, and Fox. Part of our work here must be to acknowledge the thriving heritage of these indigenous nations, which make up a translingual substrate of the city we live in that is too often eclipsed. Because the introduction to last week's event devoted to translation and language justice in border zones wasn't included in the YouTube stream where most people will listen in and some participants asked for the text, I'm going to re-articulate some of those framing remarks and link them to tonight's event dedicated to East-West on-off page transit. The so-called language barrier is permeable. So wrote the Antena Aire collaborators in opening their manifesto, Interpretation as Instigation. The artists we've gathered over the past couple of weeks have devoted their lives to that too often occulted territory between divisible languages, cultures, and states. They've made that vital permeability of the skin between expressive systems apprehensible, manifesting that the zone between languages is a lived continuum. It's a zone where a pink seesaw might be installed, transforming a violent barrier into a shared site of play, even if the infrastructure of a heavily militarized border ensures that the encounter will be fleeting, a performance lasting as livable reality for only 40 minutes, destined to the condition of a viral image provocation. In envisioning a colloquium devoted to exploratory translation, we chose this illumination from the 15th century Rohan Book of Hours as paradigm. It's behind me. The arrogant Tower of Babel, it's mostly outside of the frame, struck down, smiting its architects, and the detail of one figure who chooses to turn the fall into difference into a dive. There are many ways to fall, as last week's blizzard taught us. A fall can be multi-directional, a dance. These artists propose that we do less erecting of defensive towers and more diving, in the awareness that it might go wrong. Through their books, presses, installations, improvisations, and operatic performances, they have altered the shape of translation, removing it from the monodirectional paradigm of privatized author rendering privatized author from one language to a targeted other that somehow still reigns, despite the mirrored realities of multilingualism and supranationalist emergency that we are living at present. Realities which call for a form of translation Sawako Nakayasu calls non-binary. I have become intrigued with displaced things, said Don Miche in a 2012 interview, things that are wrong, and translation is in a perpetual state of being wrong. Antena took that utterance as epigraph for their manifesto for ultra translation. We do so many wrong things out of the fear of doing the wrong thing, said Nakayasu in a 2020 talk called Translation is a Genre. These statements suggest that the state of risking being wrong, of waywardness, may be the very state where we can most fruitfully come together. Sawako Nakayasu and Jonathan Stalling have transmuted the translingual spaces that induce so much discomfort, so much disciplinary, egocentric, and xenophobic anxiety into theatrical spaces of Brechtian encounter. But the risk therein also leads to reverie. Nakayasu's Mouth Eats Color was achieved following a dare by Jen Eleana Hoffer via Facebook. Can you do this in a month so I can teach it? The act of generating a book and its press in a month became itself a performance, inducing with each reading a promenade through the arcades of tongues that is resolutely dreamlike. Through singing the work, I believe new structures of feeling can be built to house heterocultural ways of hearing that will move us toward greater trans-Pacific consciousness, writes Stalling in his preface to the transmedia work Yinga Shur. As utopian as this may sound, it approximates the experiences we've had in teaching the work, experiences we're happy to share with the public now. A few words on how that will work. Many of us are in a Zoom room, which was appointed choice. This has meant all kinds of arrangements that Cecily Chen has skillfully and patiently helped us create. We ask that you remain muted while our speakers present, but in the end, you'll have the opportunity to launch questions either by feeding them into the chat or even better, by raising your hands and unmuting yourself to address our guests directly if you wish. I'd like to thank the sponsors who made these evenings possible. The Franke Center for the Humanities at the University of Chicago, the Master of Arts program in the Humanities, the Center for East Asian Studies, the English Department, the Experimental Performance Committee, Creative Writing, Comparative Literature, and Translation Studies, all at the University of Chicago. Many thanks to all the administrators involved and to Cecily Chen. I'll now introduce Han Saucy, with whom I'm teaching the seminar that gave rise to this series and who will be moderating this evening's discussion. Han, born in Nashville, a fact that he'll never live down, he says, is university professor with appointments in comparative literature, East Asian languages and civilizations, and the Committee on Social Thought. His last two prize-winning books were published over the past 3 years. The Ethnography of Rhythm, Orality, and Its Technologies, winner of the Modern Language Association's Scaglione Prize for Comparative Literary Studies, and Translation as Citation, Zhuangzi Inside Out, winner of the American Comparative Literature Association's Willett Prize. He has a new book to await eagerly from Princeton, titled The Making of Barbarians, China in Multilingual Asia. Take it away, Han.
Thank you, Jan. All right. Sawako, Jonathan, it is wonderful to have you with us. The idea of bringing you together was, of course, fated because we admire your work and we see the work of you two as having many things in common. I want to pick up a couple of lines from what Jen was just saying. There's an idea of translation as a kind of a magic mirror or a communication device whereby language A sends a message to language B via the translator. And if the translator is really talented, what we get in the end is what was said in language A as they would say it in language B. Right? This is an old traditional ideal of translation. It never quite happens in that way, but I want to point out that it's a kind of a circular model, a model where the ideal is restoration, right? Where A is said in the B manner. But that whole set of ideas assumes that languages A and B don't move around, don't change. In fact, what's most interesting and fascinating about translation is often the way that language B gets changed by language A and language A by language B through what translators do. And I think your work is as if it were a speeded up version of that negotiation between languages, right? The English language has been changed by the French language for 700 or 800 years. And reciprocally, what we see in your work, though, is a speeded up version of that kind of interrelation that I like to call adventurous translation. Adventurous as in the translator goes out and encounters unexpected things and somehow makes them part of a series of adventures that the text takes in the course of being translated. So I'm just talking very broadly. We'll hear some more specific examples in a bit. I don't know, in fact, if all our listeners are aware of your work. So as we pursue our conversation tonight, I'm going to stop now and again to ask you to give us a sample, to read a page or two that will bring all our audience up to speed, establish a frame of reference, show us, in fact, why we are here tonight. So Sawako, maybe I could start with you. The book Mouth Eats Color, which, as Jen mentioned, was put together in a month, is a kind of a trilingual adventure amongst Japanese, English, and French. And each of those languages, as Whitman would have said, contains multitudes. There are parts of that book that are recognizable as translation and parts of that book that defy the notion of translation, making one wonder, is this perhaps not at all a translation, but something else that started as translation? I'm wondering, would you mind reading us a page or two at your option from that book?
Sure. Hi, everyone, and thank you, Han and Jen, for bringing us all together like this. It's really exciting to meet Jonathan Stalling in this context too. Hi. In that I've known Jonathan's work for a long time. We do have interesting resonances, and I think it'll be a pleasure to share this space tonight. Thanks also to Cecily and everyone at University of Chicago for making this possible. So I will start by reading a couple of poems from this book, which is called Mouth Eats Color. And I've made a little sample to share with you as I read it, which is going to let me kind of share two poems at once in a way. So this one is called Waves. And on the left, you'll see the Japanese. This is the original poem as it was in Japanese. And then on the right is my English. And this is a regular translation, let's say. Waves. The sailors are laughing, with their teeth bared like on the barrel organs, thrashing about all over the place. Unflaggingly, they press the bellows with their entire bodies, while laughter passes from shore to shore. The laughter we have today is captive to the eternal, and silence only grows deeper still. Because the tongue is simple, like a pair of clappers. Now people simply open their mouths as when yawning. And then the next poem is called Backside. I'm going to read three poems actually, but they're linked in the sense that this is one more straightforward translation, and then the next thing I'll read will be a slightly different kind of translation. Backside, night eats color. Flower bouquets lose their fake ornaments. Day falls into the leaves like sparkling fish. The shapeless dreams and trees struggle like the lowly mud, nurtured outside this shriveled, deridable despair. And the space that was chopped down tickles the weeds by its feet. Fingers stained with cigarette tar caress the writhing darkness, and the people move forward. And then the next poem is called Waves, which is the title of the previous poem. This one is called Waves, a List of Characters and Backside. So it's 2 poems translated into one. And so on the left side, you have Waves. It cut off the title, but it's the Japanese version of Waves. On the right side, you have the same poem, Backside. And then here's the poem, which I'll show you a little bit of as I read it. So this is what the poem looks like. But I'll have you kind of look at these while I read the poem. Waves, a list of characters and backside. Husband of water, and then the people. Fresh-looking bamboo that lives fast and dies young, moves forward. That which halts rice from growing in the mouth, caress the writhing darkness. Harp of wind, tar from cigarettes. Person after handling a forest fire, fingers stained. Skin of man who goes, tickle. Kingly human flesh, these are weeds. Belly of the snake, by its feet. Hand on armor and the space beneath. Fresh-looking bamboo that lives fast and dies young, that was chopped down. Mountain above the cliff under which we shield or hang out to dry, inviolate while hurrying the knife, nurtured outside of. Myself, etc., shriveled. The day that is now, deridable despair. Fresh-looking bamboo that lives fast and dies young, now shapeless. Water that merges and flows vigorously, dreams of trees. Long duration of time it takes for energy to depart and struggle. What sinks into the heat of a black dog, like the lowly mud. Water crowning the legs of a tree. Day falls. Tongue into the leaves. White hand of wood, like sparkling fish. Single thread of a pure color. Flower bouquet. People, etc., lose their fake ornaments. Temple of the day, night, mouth eats color. So I'll stop there for the poems.
Thank you. Thank you. Those are lovely. And now, Jonathan, perhaps we could ask you to read a page or 2 from Yingge Li Shi, and then maybe an example or 2 of your classical Chinese poems in English, so we can see what's at stake, what's going on with this translation practice.
Okay, so I'll go ahead and begin with the opening aria of the opera Yingge Li Shi. And this is a scroll I created to do a reading in China a couple of years ago. So the poem, the aria begins with the short verse. The English is, I would like to tell you a story. 我要为你讲一个故事. I'd like to tell you a story. And the translation of the transliterated English is Dance of Mourning, Grief. A woman waits, missing her lover at the river's edge. So this is the work. I'll just read the whole thing real quick, and then I'll chant the poem.
I think we need to see the scroll too, because
you will in a moment. Yeah,
no.
Just one second. So this is the part you don't need. Just to tune your ears to the English. The remainder is, it begins. Close your eyes in a dark room. Open your eyes again. Outside the dark room, a face watches you, watching the dark. So 闭上眼睛，一个有暗的房间，睁开眼，而再睁开眼，幽暗的房间外面有一张脸，将你凝视黑暗。I'm going to use two, so let me start the video now over here so you can, for those who need the Chinese characters, you can read them on the second screen. So I would like to tell you a story. Okay, so this is how we will move forward. 可罗兹 your eyes 婴儿大儿可如 Open your eyes. Open your eyes again. Outside the 大儿可入目。face 我吃死我吃死 a face 我吃硬 yo I got there we are. It's longer than I thought. I got behind my scroll. 非吃死我吃硬 you 我吃硬的大儿可 It's actually quite a lot harder with the muscle to get the scroll turned with one arm. So that is the opening aria of 银歌里诗. The work, of course, for the students, I know you've read it, but for those who haven't heard it before, it's a libretto that is written in Chinese and English simultaneously, right? So the English is written in Chinese characters, but the Chinese characters have been chosen based on their meaning as well, so that the opera takes place quite literally in between the two languages. After 银歌里诗 was composed, I started another project, which I'll introduce in a moment, but Han asked if I could share a little bit about the other project. And so if 银歌里诗 is bending Chinese into English without it stopping being Chinese, then the other direction is to bend English into Chinese without it stopping being English. And so I thought I'll just chant a poem as per Han's request. And actually, Han, you might remember this one. This was a poem I think I chanted for you at the tea house at Yale when I was a grad student. I thought it would be fitting to do that now. And it's a ci form by the poet Li Yu. And so it goes like this. So the poem as a ci form is quite different than the other project that I'll talk about when I'm given a chance, because it's not a regulated verse form. So anyhow, it's a form that that would have been sung originally and then over time became a written genre. So it goes like this. 林花学了春红太匆匆，无奈招来汉语晚来风。燕安之泪流人醉几时重？自是人生长恨水长东。 Spring's red grove bloom ebb past, too fast, fast. Dawn will bring chill, rain down, night wind blast. Rouge face cry, men's gaze sigh, time piles fast. From our birth, lifelong dearth, springs flow past. So I'll go ahead and leave it there. I do hope to get a chance to talk a little bit about other vectors of that project, but that I think gets one into the space between English and Chinese, and we can move on with our conversation.
Yeah, thank you, Jonathan. So, I think everyone listening can see more or less what's happening here, right? The languages A and B, instead of being fixed and canonical and static and merely accepting a translation into this pre-established space, they are being affected by the act of translation. And things are happening to English, for example, that have never happened before. And I still feel the creepy chill of that astonishing rendering of Tzu meter into English that I felt God knows how many years ago, 10 or 12 at least, in New Haven. Now, but while I'm going overboard with my enthusiasm, I feel that maybe we should clear away some puzzlement, some doubts, some suspicions that may be lingering out in the air. There may well be someone, not necessarily emerging from under a rock, who will object that what we've just heard isn't translation at all, but is something else, some monstrous hybrid, maybe even something antithetical to translation, something that gets in the way of good translations being done by serious people. I wonder, Sawako and Jonathan, how you would answer such an objection. Would you like to answer the comment and clarify how what you've done is or isn't translation, or whether it can both be and not be translation? Or should your procedures be recognized under some other heading? What kind of object are we dealing with here, in your opinion?
I think you're pointing at me, though I'm on the other side of you, in my side of this.
An error of translation, yes, in the geometrical sense.
But monstrous hybrid, yeah. I didn't mean to start with that, but since you said it, I think that partly as a result of being an immigrant human in this country, I feel some degree of monstrous hybridity already. And when I was making that book that has the subtitle Translations, Anti-Translations, and Originals, I think the first kind of opposition that's noticeable is translation and anti-translation. But I think that I was using that notion of an anti-translation as kind of a mode of escaping whatever we already conventionally understand as translation. So by leaping out of that, I believe one of the things I'm really interested in is actually the space between a translation and an original text. And that that goes along with the notion of a poet translator. We kind of use that phrase among those of us who are also poets and also translators. But I wondered if sort of to what degree those identities can merge, and if a text that I make can be a poem and a translation at the same time, or to different degrees. Sometimes I'm just doing a translation, as everybody understands. Sometimes I'm just doing a poem, and sometimes I'm doing both in one poem, or alternating or moving through the course of one poem. So it is hybrid. And I think it's also part of what you said about in the introduction about adventurous translation. That's a nice way to look at it in terms of if it is indeed some kind of landscape, then I'm interested in what exists at the edges of translation, and it turns out it's kind of the farther out you go, the more there is. So yeah. there's a lot of land or space to adventure into.
Yeah, well, that's the experience of the reader of your book for sure.
Thanks.
Jonathan, what about your particular type of monstrosity? In the best sense of the word, of course.
You're muted.
Oh dear, somebody muted you.
That somebody was me. Sorry. I'll take monstrosity, although every project is different and actually has a different ethos, a different purpose. Not that everything is instrumental, but there are decisions that are made, and I think some accountabilities that have to be thought through for different translation projects. So some are clearly bent toward the exploratory, and others are much more in need of an accountability to the source text and so on. So every project is very distinct. I'm happy to talk about, like Ingo Li Shi is a distinct one, but it's actually quite different than the second text that I wrote, or that I performed there. The second text, of course, is an author who's been dead for a millennium. That's quite different and distinct from a living author, especially one that's not canonical, and needs to find an audience, right? So to my sense is that translation is either, it's one of three kind of vectors for me. Either it is a translation archive and scholarship work, which is about conservation. I'll talk about that a bit later, perhaps. Then there's advocacy and literary advocacy and community building, which is more like curating publications and doing translation and publishing translation. And then there's the, and teaching translation. And then there's the exploratory, where sometimes it's the goal is a mongrelization in the face of monolingual aesthetic constructs and schema that would create a lens such as monstrosity through which to view something, and it means something particular. We want to make it so monstrous and so sublime, and that original sense of Longinus is sublime, that it blows the lens away and it restores a space from which it emerges in between value systems, between languages, which are these
Godzilla
value systems. Yeah, so I'm happy to do that, but sometimes I definitely feel like it is quite to, in fact, push one particular value system quite upon the other, and that's the second project to bring, as it were, regulated Chinese verse culture, its cosmologies, quite uncomfortably, and park it right in the middle of English. Wow. And see what happens, and that again is very distinct from a different kind. So I'm super excited to hear that and where the conversation goes, and we'll see which of these vectors we thicken and which wait for next time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, obviously I'm using monster kind of as a joke, but one thing about monsters is that, when they appear on the horizon, of course, everyone says, we could never have predicted this, right? This monster is totally unexpected, which is not really the case for writing, right? Writing is always preceded by something or somebody. So I'm wondering, how about your predecessors in translation, right? We're looking at traditions that are relatively young when you think about, the whole history of translation, but, not without a past. So I'm wondering, who did you learn from? And I don't necessarily mean who did you model yourselves on, since sometimes we learn what we want through a powerful feeling of disgust or rejection towards something that somebody else did badly or did wrong, right? Anti-models can sometimes be powerful models. So who are the important predecessor translators, the good ones or the bad ones on your horizon?
I can't remember which way to look, Swakam. I think it's this way.
I was going to say, if you wanted to keep going, it's fine too.
No, I need a break.
Okay. I can point pretty easily to the one and only time I studied translation formally, which was with someone I consider a great translator, Keith Waldrop. And I took a workshop with him in literary translation. And one of the things he repeated often was, make it better in the translation. And, I've sort of taken that and run with it, but also sort of interpreted it in a number of ways since then in terms of what it is, and that it can be interpreted expansively, and what better is. And I found that really useful and concise and empowering, in that so much of the anguish of translation is the confrontation with some text that we think is great. And what are we going to do with this great text? So the notion of making it better is kind of a beautiful, impossible challenge, maybe, but also not impossible. He was actually saying, do that, make it better. But the other thing that happened in that class was, and this really did sort of cement something I thought about it, was the first thing we were supposed to do as students in the class was to translate something that had already been translated, and then compare it and present it to the class. And at that moment, my French was better than my Japanese.
Fruits and stuff you require or want?
And so I translated a text that I loved by Nathalie Sarraute called Tropisms. Not the whole thing, I just did a little sample of it. And I presented it to the class. And this student commented, and he said, "That's interesting." And the way that he said interesting was very weird, and I didn't quite understand what he was saying. But eventually I figured out that he was saying, oh, that's interesting that I might pursue something or a text that already had an established and wonderful translator. Like, there's no room for me to make a career out of translating Nathalie Sarraute. And once I figured that out, I thought that's really interesting, because it never occurred to me to make that the primary decision about translation, to build a career or a name for myself, or that kind of, I don't know, value system. And so Keith wasn't like that either. He really didn't have that kind of careerist ambition himself, even though he was so prolific and erudite and fantastic. So when I went to Japan, which was shortly after I finished grad school, the first poet I fell in love with happened to be pretty much unknown, even though I managed to stumble into it through a sort of fortuitous coincidence. And her work was completely out of print. I could only find it on a blog by some teenage girl. She had typed up the poems and put it up there, and I read them, and I just immediately loved them. And that was Chika Sagawa, who I continued to translate. So I do really want to thank Keith for instilling those values in me quite early. And I guess I think that maybe I'll pause there for now. Yeah, there's more to that story, but.
Yeah, okay. How about you, Jonathan?
So I guess this would probably be a good moment, since we're talking about history, and to walk around where we are and talk about it while we look at objects. So I'm going to flip this over. So we're in
the tour.
University of yes, a little bit of tour. University of Oklahoma. This is the Chinese Literature Translation Archive. And, I'll start with Wai Lim Yip. So Ye Weilian, Han will remember this from my dissertation. I had a chapter on him, which was a little bit shrill, because, I disagree with a lot of the ideas that he has about what I called a kind of modernist Taoist poetics. Especially in light of changing power dynamics in China, where it's no longer needing to be seen as the other of the world in quite the sense that it was in the 1970s when he was writing. But Wai Lim Yip, he's really fearless, and he did extraordinary work through not only his research on Ezra Pound, his translations of T.S. Eliot, but his own work really pushed the boundaries of what a sentence was, and tried to refashion the cadence and the syntactic duration of Baihua, of colloquial Chinese, to fit English patterns of speech. And then he did the reverse to try to bring Chinese syntactical kind of spare quality of classical Chinese into the English language. Wolfgang Kubin, another person who's the archive has collected, is one of the most prolific translators of poetry into German, and I think is an exemplar of a poet as a friend, someone who has many decades long friendships with many dozens of poets and has really worked hard to be their advocate, and that for, there's 100 books of translation. Up here we see a couple of letters by Howard Goldblatt. It's a joke, it's not a couple letters, it's like 80, back and forward between the editors at Renditions in Hong Kong. And this is all of them discussing translation problems in this novella by Yang Jiang. There's quite a few more letters than there are pages in the book. And so as one goes through Howard Goldblatt's illustrious career, one sees these incredibly interesting spaces between translation, between the text that he's working on and the translator. This is a dialogue with him and Mo Yan discussing how to talk about how to bring into English ways of feeding cows in Gaomi province in China, things that aren't in the book but need to be understood conceptually to translate it. And then of course we have Ezra Pound's Cathay. This is Arthur Waley's copy. This, I don't know if you can see it, but this is Arthur Waley. He's a really, I think, important translator. He's crossed out the word tranquil repose and he's replaced it with void and tasteless. It's not his commentary, it's a better translation. He breaks through the metaphysical boundaries of English and introduces a Buddhist pathos that void and tasteless could be positive, is basically incomprehensible to his Victorian predecessors. And so each of these poets, and of course Ezra Pound being one of them, has really changed the languages that they're working in. And maybe a couple more here very quickly. We have Yang Mu, another Taiwan poet, also who did quite a bit to change the manner in which poetry in Chinese is written, based on a kind of trans-Pacific influence. So what we see in early Chinese history with Hu Shi and Guo Murou and these guys continue on through the 20th century, really changing Chinese to bring in many different languages, such that it's quite a different language than it was 100 years before, and that continues. That work continues to this day. And so I'll just finish here. This is Arthur Waley's personal library of books. And so when you come into CLTA, you come into different translators' personal libraries. So the outside, this is all Howard Goldblatt's reference material, and this is Arthur Waley. So those are just a few important ones. Sorry, I'm going to walk one more moment and just show one last book. I'm sorry, but this one may be a little less expected, and maybe I can get a chance to talk about it later. But some of my biggest inspirations don't come from translators, but come from phonologists and those who work on trying to invent modern Chinese linguistics, which is a really huge mashup of conceptual systems of what language is to begin with, let alone how to translate it. So I'm really interested in the flexible period between Chinese kind of pre-modern period and modernity, and to reimagine English as if it were equally flexible, equally porous, and capable of being reimagined from a different paradigm, from a different set of assumptions about the universe.
Yeah, tremendous. So there are really good reasons for thinking that translation is a reciprocal event, right? It doesn't just stop with the work that's being translated, or the translator, or the translator's talents, or the translator's audience, but goes on beyond these things. Maybe performance really is the domain in which your work, both of your work, is most at home, because that's the place where you can exhibit the newness and the strangeness and also the everydayness of what you're doing. Right? Maybe we should talk a little bit about performance, right? Translation, in a way, is a performance, although when people mention a translator's performance in the traditional setup of translation, it can never be a good thing. As we know from Lawrence Venuti, translators are expected to be invisible. But by flipping that scenario and taking to the stage, demanding space and time and noise for your translations, I think you're doing something new. In your experience, how has doing performance maybe changed the way that you look at what you're up to? How have your audiences received it?
Let's see. Well, I just want to say that I enjoyed so much hearing you sing and perform a little bit of your translations tonight. That's really such a treat and such a central component of what you're doing. And I think that translation or performance is interesting because as a poet, I come into the language with a certain conversation around the sound of poetry, and poetry being auditory and sensitive to sound. And I think that all of those things were at work when I was translating the official version, the collected poems of Chikasagawa. And sound is something we really struggle with often in translation. And I think that I guess I would say that my relationship to performance is mostly through dance and music, and at the same time I'm interested in a certain kind of vector of performance art where people were doing durational performance works. So when I learned about Tetching Shea and Linda Montano tying themselves to each other by a rope for a year as art and as life, that really left an impression on me that was pretty indelible. And at the same time, there's so many factors that converged in Mouth Eats Color. One of them being, I wrote this book maybe less than a year after I had my first child. And one of my friends said, "Oh, Sawako, are you going to start writing mommy poems now?" and
Face plant.
And I didn't have an answer to that. But in fact, it did change my life to become a mother. And one of the things that it did was it shaped time differently. And so when I was in the situation of having an academic job and a baby and a partner who was still stuck in the corporate world in Japan, which meant he never came home until very late, it was a stressful life. And then I had this 1 month open up where I didn't have to teach and I didn't have to do anything. I had a daycare to put my child in. Time opened up and said, "Oh, I can do what I want with this time." And I've spent all this time performing as a mother and performing as a teacher and et cetera, et cetera. And I said, well, this is a moment, this is a month I'm going to perform being a poet again. And then there was that dare from Jen Hoffer, said, "Can you do it in a month?" Which is ridiculous. But I also want to mention too, that at the same moment that all of these thoughts were going on, I was living in Japan. I'm in a Japanese poetry community, or getting to know about the Japanese poetry community, where poets are paying exorbitant sums to publish their books. And at the same time, I'm kind of still keeping an ear tuned to the American poetry landscape, where someone had become very upset because a small publisher was publishing their book, and they didn't have enough money, and they asked the author to chip in a little bit. And the author got very upset at this notion of having to pay a little bit to publish their own work. And so I was feeling myself between these two economies. And I thought, how could I, like, in what ways could I potentially divest from these economic relationships of poetry and publishing? And the only answer to that was to do it myself. And so I'm thinking kind of really loosely about what it means to perform being an artist as I'm making this book. And I guess I've done different iterations of performance and translation in other projects too, which I can talk about later maybe if we have time.
Thank you. Yeah, Jonathan?
You're muted.
Unmute.
It's so funny. A year of Zoom, right? How many times will I not unmute myself? It's ridiculous. I was just saying, I really enjoy what you were saying, to recast what we mean by performance. I think that makes a lot of sense, in the same way that we are with translation. But I would like to take a step back and just with Sawagu's work. I mean, you really do work with, seems like, a lot of performance artists, or there's a lot of stage material that one can find online. And I'd really encourage those of you who haven't done so to just go to your website, where you have a lot of these older projects that do include a lot of performance art, and just take it in. I mean, I think when you get to work with performers on a stage and you have that kind of collaborative ethos coming together, and it seems like a lot of spontaneous stuff is happening in the work. And I'm just more curious to hear more about you talk about performance in that sense, about what the score looks like, or what the relationship of their actions. It seems to unfold pretty organically, and that there might be a kind of broad or loose schema that people are participating in. But before I talk, can you say a little bit more about your work as a performance artist in conjunction with other performers and some of the staged work that you have online?
Thanks for that, Jonathan. This is maybe perhaps not exactly what you're referring to, but I forgot I meant to mention a translation of a performance piece that I had done, which is interesting for the layers of collaboration that go into it. And I think Jen is holding it up. It's Costume en Face by the Buto dancer Tatsumi Hijikata. And one day I was asked in an email with the subject heading said, "Don't say no." And the invitation came from Yelena Glesman, who I was colleagues with. She's a performance artist herself, a wonderful artist, but we were colleagues. She knew that I was a mom with a full-time job and kind of going crazy. But she had this project that she really wanted me to do. And I almost never take on projects that other people ask me to do, but this one I couldn't say no. So I'm going to share a little bit of this project, which begins with a notebook by, so the notebook is attributed to Hijikata. It's written down by Moe Yamamoto, his principal dancer. So there's already a dance piece that's being spoken, communicated to the dancer who's taking notes. So this is his handwriting. And it's a notebook that contains that dance. These are the notes that allow the dancer to understand and remember and learn this dance. So, I saw this and I thought, oh my God, can't possibly. What do you mean? I can barely read it. And fortunately, they had interns who were willing to help me decode this work. And so the next thing they gave me was, okay, wait, let me share that, was an Excel sheet. So I was presented with this, you see these numbers correspond to blocks from the notebook, and then they had someone transcribe the Japanese into type so that I could read it at least. And there were some things they couldn't read either. And I like how they kept the orthography from the notebook. Like there are words like this fgang, which the Chinese characters are difficult to write. So in handwriting, it uses katakana as an abbreviation. And katakana is usually used for foreign words, but in handwriting, it's often used as just shorthand. So I translated this Excel sheet, and then it still wasn't a book. So it then had to become and then we had this wonderful designer, Steve Chodorowski, who was the typesetter of this book. And he did this magical thing of pulling out the handwritten scribbles and diagrams and inserting the Japanese, and then doing the same with the English. So we could preserve that sense of notebook and diagram and relationships to these words, this language. And all of this is done in conjunction with the Hijikata archive in Japan. And they were so nice. They even brought the dancer Moe-san from the mountainside where he lived, and they brought him down to Japan, and he talked to me, and we had a conversation about this notebook and what things meant, and the syntax of the dance language and that translation. So normally when you're going to the original creator of a text you're translating, you're asking about the words, but in this case, he's the dancer, and I would ask him what the dance was that corresponded to the language, and he broke down the syntax for me. So there's this movement, and then there's this movement in the style of this artist or image, or the various elements that were in the text. So it was really kind of a multiple series of events that led to that translation. And now I understand there are some people who have been making dances out of that book. So that's something I haven't seen too much of, but I hear it's happening, and it's
yeah, the book is an act of transmission, right? You're, in a way, you're decoding some knowledge that, were it not for that dancer, were it not for the sympathetic people who are willing to mediate between those scribbled notes and you, the knowledge would have been lost, right? It would have evaporated, because just the marks in the notebook wouldn't really suffice to reconstruct much, I guess.
Well, but the other thing that was interesting was actually we sat down and watched video of the performance together with the dancer. And the hilarious part of it was that he was, as he's watching it and he's looking at the notebook, and he's like, wow, like the dance is totally different, and so much has changed since the moment of the notebook and the moment of the performance. And so it's really kind of just the sliver and a snapshot of what that work was, which also feels similar to what translation is. It's a sliver or a snapshot of one person reading one text in one moment in time. So I felt that kind of parallel.
Yeah, that's a beautiful story.
I've switched over to my laptop so I can share a screen real quick about performance. So a moment. So we're going to open up a PowerPoint here and take a look at just the kind of undergirding mechanism of classical Chinese poetry is this oscillation between this ping sound, as it's called, and a zi sound, or a kind of long vowel and a clipped one. And the oscillation basically dictates the maximum amount of variation on a horizontal line between the long and short, if you will, and then also a balance, either antithetical, so it's opposing. So here you can see a black dot on top and a white dot below it. So your compositional constraint will be vertical almost as much as it is horizontal, because you have to choose a word that has the antithetical or oppositional sound, but also in parallel meaning or antithetical meaning, so that you're both semantically creating a kind of parallel, what we could call a positive resonance or a negative resonance. So when one's looking at this, these kind of algorithms that generate classical Chinese poetry, it can be pretty dry. Like it seems extremely mechanistic, and like dictates, would kind of, as it were, takes life out of it. But it's when we think about it as a oral work, that I think we can actually see what this stuff does and what, and so it's meant, if there is a positive and negative resonance that happens both semantically in the meaning of the words and a vertical and horizontal relationship, as well as the sound, then it is in the body, that's the resonance chamber, wherein these things come into being. And so when we hear the classical Chinese poems chanted, and we try to move that into English, and we retune English so that it rhymes with Chinese, by which we mean, resonates, such that it resonates in exactly the same patterns of length and brevity. That all is performance, right? Because you can do it conceptually sort of on the page, but it has to be done in the human body. That's where it happens in terms of the production of sound. But more importantly, it's the reception of sound. It's the sociality of poetry and poetics. Poetry is done with other people, and it is that bonding that takes place that arguably is so important to the functioning, the whole imagined community of whatever China was before nation states existed. So much of this is in the poetry, and so the Shigen in Japan, is this sort of extension of the same tradition where Japanese poets are using these rules to create, Chinese poetry, not knowing a word of Chinese, but can actually use the algorithms to do it. But I would entreat all of you to YouTube Shigin, Shigin, and listen to, to the way in which Japanese, Sino-Japanese is intoned. It's extraordinarily distinct from Chinese, extremely local, very Japanese. And yet it is an extension of an imaginary, a cosmology, wherein the human body is space between heaven and earth. It is a conduit wherein the patterns of the Tao are made manifest, in this space between heaven and earth. And that these broad, massive cosmologies and so on, all I think come down. They're only believable. A hermeneutics of faith is only possible when it's intoned, when it's performed, when it's social, and it's shared, and most importantly, when it's embodied. So if I won't do this as a teacher, I want to go into this poem, but I'm going to actually stop sharing because I'll start.
Oh, wait, Jonathan, can you please just can you at least read a little bit of what we're looking at so that we can hear it?
We want to hear like the long and the short vowel sounds.
I was about to do so, but I was going to read off the page rather than read this one. But what we can do is we can see that these little black dots, and I'm so sorry, it will take a few moments, but the black dots are either a third or fourth tone in modern Mandarin. But modern Mandarin, we have to remember, is a modern invention. It's just a dialect of Chinese that was randomly, in a certain sense, chosen to be Chinese, to be the standard. Prior to Mandarin being chosen to be Chinese, it was instead there was an imagined world of sounds, which was a negotiation of northern and southern dialects that no one actually spoke, a synthetic way of pronouncing Chinese that would maintain what was called the rusheng, or an entering tone. It was like an English word that has a T, P, or K at the end. And because of allophons, the allophonic nature of monosyllables, it will shorten, it will take your vowel, like cad is long, cat is short. It just crunches it really short. And so when you're singing it, you can't sing those syllables. So when you're chanting it, it will just take it and collapse it in. And it creates this really strong, pungent flavor that will happen between the two. So these first two characters are actually both rusheng, so they're very short. Yue luo. And so moonlight, light is a short English vowel because of the T sound, it shortens it. So yue luo wu qi, and then shuang man tian, like this. And so you take that man is short, and then tian is long. Jiang feng yu huo, dui cao mian, like this. Sweet gums, boat light, wei gai lai. Then gu su chang wai, han shan si. And that fourth tone is not a rusheng, but it takes that the rhyme in it is the opposite. So whereas the rhyming words have to be long vowels, very sonorous, and they can be attenuated a long time, but you just can't take those fourth tones long, and so it sucks it up. And so we would have to imagine that on the English side, outside Suzhou Han Shan Shine, and just let that, it's like the vocable just falls on the ground, it just hits the ground. Then Ye Ban, very short, from Bo Zhong Sheng Dao Ke, all the way down, hits the ground. Chuan, right? From boat, bells ring, sound close by. And so you combine them and you get this really extraordinary sound. Now, I'm going to stop sharing and I'll sing one to you very briefly so that you're not distracted by trying to figure it all out. So here's a different poem. 朝辞白帝彩云间 千里江陵一日还，两岸猿声啼不住，轻舟已过万重山。And in that space, you have, so much more to communicate than you can possibly imagine in free verse. And so free verse ends up being an extraordinarily impoverished medium within which to communicate, share, socialize, let alone feel the cosmopolitan global vibe of what Chinese poetry is. I mean, it is this incredibly transnational, translingual. There are like hundreds of Chinese languages. Everyone's rhyming in this imagined kind of thing, sharing poems, within what we call Chinese, hundreds of languages. Then you have Vietnamese, Korean, Japanese, all doing it. And so, when given a chance, I'll show how English works. But there's a big project, and you can check this out other places. But right now we're almost at the end of our poetry competition period. 1 week left to submit your regulated English verse. But this is about a 20 years project to teach children how to build these poems using all of the rules of classical Chinese in English, so that it's not done here at universities and in academia, but is done in the social world where poetry happens, and that we re-engineer English, like Han said, we catalyze and speed up, as it were, a kind of Sino-English, so that we can communicate, I think, incredibly important pathos from China into, out of it, such that China doesn't feel so enclosed, so cut off, and so special also, by virtue of being untranslatable. Languages are radically porous, and they can and do change to facilitate much more than what we call translation. And Japanese is an incredibly good language to demonstrate, that porousness and the way in which it was retooled in order to do Chinese poetry. And so English just so happens to be one of these languages, like Japanese. It's like super heterogeneous and has so many things we can do with it, because it is a monstrosity, as Han said. So performance is meant to, is vital to it. One last brief thing, about my own performance is that, it's very important to me as a poet to not be where all the work happens. So English is not for me to sing, I think it's very complicated when I, as a white man, sing this work. I mean, it's a libretto, and it was sung and done in China for a Chinese audience, and then it has a diasporic function to think about the way in which we hear this kind of interlanguage between Chinese and English in an American context. And so it's published in the book form, very much fronting the inability to hear interlanguage from the American English, historically vexed, misunderstanding, misconstruing of Chinese English as being something of mistaken or accented, as we call it, et cetera. And so, there's a lot of different ways and different communities and stuff does different things, but I don't think of myself as being the performer for that. And so I'm not very practiced, actually. But I did want to do good by you, Han, and to do, although I should have practiced once more with the scroll. But I do think that performance is, you have to be accountable, at least answerable to what we do with our bodies, because they are part of language, and where and who we are is a part of the syntax of its meaning. And so I try to be very thoughtful about how and where and when a work of art is intoned by me, and try really hard to displace the performance into other, to others in other communities, and to curate that somewhat. But anyway, yeah, there it is.
Yeah, well, this goes back to something that we've been talking about for many years, that that earlier generation of people who made Chinese poetry happen in English, Waley and Pound and so on, they didn't have any access to Chinese sound. And in fact, they were so entranced with the idea of an ideographic language, as they called it, mistakenly. Everybody said that at the time. They were all mistaken. That they simply behaved as if sound had nothing to do with it. And you are making that an untenable illusion, which is, definitely a service to international understanding and to poetry too. But really, both of you, I think, deal with these languages that we can just call non-alphabetical, right? Languages that are not restricted to using the ABC as their medium. You play with the different registers of language that become possible in Japanese and Chinese. You invite readers who don't think of themselves perhaps as speaking Japanese and Chinese to do things with those languages, which again is another way of mutating the A and B poles and showing that they're not poles at all anymore. I don't know if I've overstated or gone completely into the weeds there, Sawako. But what is your sense of writing systems as a component of your compositional process?
One of the things that I was asked often, I was in my late 20s when I moved to Japan, so I had no formal education in Japanese, or a tiny bit on Saturdays when I was kind of a rebellious student and did not want to learn Japanese in that context. So when I moved to Japan in my late 20s, I was fluent, conversationally fluent, because I'm a heritage speaker, but I was not educated. And yet I had this desire to read poetry. And I, at the time, was very, I was kind of waving the avant-garde flag really hard. And so I had to find the most experimental and kind of linguistically interesting poetry I could find in Japanese, which often meant that I was reading texts where I couldn't read it, in the sense that, in English, if we read a text, we could still say all the words out loud, even if we didn't understand what we were saying. Whereas when I was reading Japanese, I couldn't say them, especially because of those Chinese characters. And what happened was that it changed my relationship to reading in such a way where I can look at a Chinese character and sense meaning out of it without having complete confidence or clarity. And often, these things are difficult because they do have multiple meanings and multiple nuances based on those characters. And so I just developed, and I think this is, like children reading in Japanese would go through this also, where you're reading texts and you're reading them in your mind in a sort of non-verbal or non-pronounceable space. And that opened up another portal of my relationship to language, which I think eventually, moving through that and then moving through these experiments, led me to writing poems that I couldn't read myself. And so there are poems in this book that are only pulling the Chinese characters out. And it's not that I can't read those characters, but because they're out of context, they have lost their syntax. And I myself no longer know what semantic relationships exist. I trust that they do, but I know that they, some of those poems got there as a kind of extraction or abstraction of a poem I was translating. And I'm also pointing too to that hierarchy of the three main scripts that we have in Japanese. We have the Chinese characters, which is the source of all the written language. And then there's the hiragana, which is phonetic, which is also seen as feminine. And then there's the katakana. So the kanji is seen as masculine if you were to assign gender.
Yeah.
Not that it's commonly spoken of that way, but I think that kind of nuance still exists. And then katakana is used for sounds and foreign words, which are initially sounds. And so those power relationships within the orthography, I saw Sagawa Chika experimenting with them. I met Kyunmi Park, who's a Korean Japanese poet, and she was writing her own name in hiragana, which is not the convention for Koreans in Japan or Korean Japanese Zainichi people. And so I saw her kind of activating those relationships. And so those kinds of differences in orthography became very interesting in my own translation work, or in this particular book. So the piece that I read at the very beginning of our conversation, the last thing I read was using the Chinese characters, only the Chinese characters that were in the first poem, but describing each character as if it was a poem in itself because of the different radicals. And I was sort of constructing a poem out of each character. Another kind of iteration of expanding out of a text, whatever it had.
Yeah, yeah. You and I can make a great team because I can only read the Chinese characters. I mean, I know the phonetic values of the hiragana, but I have to stop and remember and say, okay, what does this mean? Now anyway. So it's funny how this landscape of writing, invites different kinds of participation. Speaking of participation, I've forgotten to invite people to send questions and comments into chat. I know we're getting close to the end of the time that we've allotted, but do please send us your questions. I want to ask one last question of Sawako and Jonathan, which is really just sort of an over-the-wall sort of question, which is, what do you desire from translation? If you were to receive, let's say, a huge endowment and a house in the mountains in which to hold translation residencies, what kind of work would you be looking for, hoping for, or encouraging, not just in yourself, but in others? What is the potential in translation that's most alive for you?
So can you hear me, Han?
I can indeed.
Yeah, so I'm running my audio through my second phone, or my phone camera, and I'm not going to answer this one, Han. So I'm very curious to know what you'll be doing, Sawako, with your money and estate, because I do want to talk a little bit about the grapheme as well, because one large part, really the bit that I've been doing since English has really been wrapped up in rethinking whether, in fact, Chinese isn't alphabetic or can't be used in this way. And so there's this book here by Li Ruzhen. Here I brought the original. It was actually translated into English by Lin Yuntang's daughter, but it's quite abbreviated. But he's a Qing dynasty, so he's working in 18th century, and he writes this wonderful fantasy novel. It's very much a Gulliver's Travels kind of novel, and he goes to many lands. And one of the lands that he goes to is the land of fork-tongue people or split-tongue people. And the word "split" here means fan qie. It is the way of splitting characters into consonants and vowels, what we call them in English. And he imagines that this island of people have something like a magical rhyme table, because their language, they have two tongues. And so their language is the most phonologically complicated in the world. And yet they use Chinese characters to spell that language. And so he imagines this rhyme table for the most complicated language. And by virtue of it being able to hack that language's phonological system of Chinese characters, it could therefore unlock any language in the world, almost in real time. So you actually follow the characters as they learn how to use the rhyme table from the, this is way too hard, to, wait a second, it makes sense, it's intuitive and I can use it. Well, it turns out he's not at all a closeted phonologist. The author is trying to invent Mandarin, and he's trying to do what has been done for centuries before, which is to marry aspects of different dialects into a synthetic form of modern Chinese. And so he imagines in a fictional way to broaden this such that Chinese could be, in a way, a script wherein one can write the rest of the world's languages. And so I, somewhat inspired by this, although I did find it a bit later, but it is nonetheless very similar to my second project, which is basically to take Chinese characters and to use the same method, which is used for 1500 years in China, to become an alphabet for English. And so these printing presses here are printing presses for English textbooks from the Song Dynasty, is my imagined world. So those Chinese poems that kids are writing in classical Chinese would then have a rhyme table that tells you how to rhyme them. The rhyme table is inscribed in Chinese characters. And so one can look at these and it looks Chinese, but in fact it isn't. This is an H sound, ha, what they are. They're hog, bob. Down here it says hug, and so on. And so, it turns out we only have this kind of conception of Chinese characters being non-phonetic only because they were kicked out really not until the mid 20th century, kicked out and replaced by the Roman. There was a period of Chinese history where they're competing with one another, but it turns out this is very hard to use this system for Chinese because of the tones. It's actually quite a lot easier to use it for non-Chinese languages like English. Because you don't have to worry about all these different characters for tones. And so I just want to take you guys over as my last thing to the sort of, this work becomes more about installations and the physical artifactualization of interlanguages and how we can kind of reimagine them. So this is the English language, the entire English language, and the consonants are on the outside, and the vowels are on the inside. And so every English word exists in this type, and it's organized in a way, inspired by the originals. And then of course one puts it into the boxes and puts them in. And the idea is not to in any way, kind of play with Orientalism, but to quite radically subject English to every epistemological, phonological assumption undergirding language in China prior to the arrival of honestly some pretty arbitrary ideas about language that come in via Western scholarship, very much Victorian and wrong. And those are translated, into Chinese and are still used today with all sorts of dichotomies and binaries that are not about the natural world, but about history. And there are accretions of power. And so my sense is that, these things we think are very set, such as ideogram or letter, are in fact incredibly fluid, always have been, and will be again.
Yeah. To expand this, we could look into Manchu translation policies and so on. It's an indefinitely expanding universe, but this is tremendous. Both of you are showing us the linguistic world that we live in, even as polyglots, more truly and more strange than we knew it before. I want to look into the chat where we have a question for Sawako from Joseph Ruprecht, who says, you had mentioned immersing yourself in the Japanese poetry community after you moved there. Would you mind speaking to that process? Were there Japanese literary journals you paid particular attention to? How did you find the work of the poets you translated in For from Japan? There's Joseph's question.
Hi, thanks for your question. When I went to Japan, I knew very little about Japanese poetry, and fortunate for me, there's a cultural understanding that in a bookstore one is free to read whatever books you want to for as long as you want to, and there are even chairs that you can sit in, so it's almost like a library. And I guess the understanding is that you're going to leave that book in the same condition that it was in. So I went to what was the largest poetry bookstore in Tokyo, and I just randomly read all over that store, and I pulled things off shelves and read and got interested in something, and then slowly started to find presses or journals or things that were especially interesting to me. So it was very uncharted and unmediated by anything besides me and the books. And was it difficult to be a woman doing so? Well, so the great part was just me and the books. The difficult part was when I actually started to want to translate, and I had to start communicating with poets with their extreme sensitivity to language and my uneducated Japanese, and really kind of terrible kinds of communication happened in that process, I think. And I probably offended a few people. I think it also interested a few people. I probably seemed authentic as one who could translate into another language because my Japanese was clearly not my
so
primary.
terrible, and her English must be great.
But it was very interesting too, because there's a difference between people who were like, yes, I would love to be translated into English, or looked at me very suspiciously and said, why would I want that? And who are you? And it's a culture of networking and connections and being introduced to people. So just to come out of nowhere, as I did, was very strange. And I also learned things about the Japanese community that were in stark contrast to what I understood about the American poetry community. So there were issues around that, and some of that was about gender. Some of that was about power and hierarchy and people, being sent to fetch cigarettes for their elder poet or whatever it was. There were a lot of cultural, social things around it that didn't quite sit right with me, because I'm an American I'm an American in a Japanese body, and that causes a certain kind of confusion.
Yeah. And Jonathan, you've been poet in residence in China. Did you encounter any feelings of mismatch from your audiences there? How did people get their minds around the idea of you being a poet in residence in China?
I've done it at a couple of places. Beijing University was pretty academic, so I was poet in residence there, and so it was mostly poetics lectures. No poetry reading on campus, actually, but then in Hongcun, which is a village near Huangshan, that was a place where I was able to kind of meet some of the locals and do a poetry reading and talk to school kids and things like that. Typically, because the work is, I did read work in Chinese, like free verse written in Chinese, as well as the classical Chinese poems, and performed in Galishi a bit. So it's pretty decipherable, I suppose, but surprising, no doubt. But China is such a warm and gracious place to be, and poetry is enjoyed by many, especially classical poems. So of course, that's quite. They're always very lovely, public instances. In terms of the poetry community there, it is. Like any poetry community, it takes time to meet people and to kind of network and kind of know who's doing what scene and where one might read, or who's reading, and so that's just time and sentience, our mind and our what we give to other people, I guess, is important. Otherwise, you shouldn't have a time to read if you're not listening to other people read, or going out and doing the work to be receptive of the local scenes.
Yeah. All right.
I don't see another question in the chat, so I'm just going to reiterate that people should feel free to either raise their hands, which we'll be able to see so they can unmute themselves, or just
I'd like to answer Han's question about the residency in the mountains. Maybe it
Yeah.
wasn't in the mountains, but the notion of what I would want to do or see or make space for. It just made me think of a moment when I was talking to someone who had been translating John Ashbery into Spanish. And in the very challenging process of translating John Ashbery, he landed on this term, so we have idiolects, and he was thinking of Ashbery's work as an idiolect. And then he decided that he needed to be an idiotranslator in order to translate Ashbery. And that concept is really beautiful to me, the notion of an idiotranslator, and that we might recognize certain people's translational work. And so I think that would be something I would encourage, is for to make space for that kind of idiotranslation.
Yeah.
I'm so glad you answered the question. I did want to hear your answer, even if I would be embarrassed of my real answer, which is probably like sleep and go hiking. I don't know. Yeah, I was afraid of what I might say.
Jonathan, I actually had a question about what you said in response to that question about the Chinese characters themselves being malleable, and your invention of Chinese characters to represent sounds that were not necessarily connected to syllables as they are in the Chinese language. I'm just kind of asking if I'm understanding that correctly. So you're suggesting that that you could create a phonetic Chinese script that can articulate the sounds of other languages, perhaps even better than they can articulate Chinese language? Is that correct?
Yes. Things have to happen for it to work well. And most of those have to do with the ability to coerce or to incentivize people to learn how to use language differently. So we do extraordinary things when schools tell us to, when we have a reason to. And so, to alter our behavior, around a writing system is actually, they're very malleable, they're very porous, and they change, but our habits with them are incredibly concrete, and they do take exogenous external forces to liberate the individual to think differently and be different in language, I think, especially in a transcription system. But yes, what you described is right. A Chinese character is a syllable, but a syllable has a front initial consonant, and it has a vowel invariably. And so if you cut that sound and such that it either represents the consonant or the vowel, and you memorize those 40 characters, you can then transcribe English with almost perfect fidelity phonologically, because we happen to share the same distinctions between of a kind of voiced, even though it's differently voiced and unvoiced consonants like P and B are distinct in Chinese and in English in nearly the same way. And our vowels happen to be distributed around, for the most part, the same places, such that in standard Mandarin, as it's spoken today, and standard English, as we imagine it, can be linked on a one-to-one between phonemes at a phoneme level, and then we just simply use algorithms to generate a writing system. And so you can go to the Apple Store and download my app called Pinyin, and it's all there, and you can play with 3D learning tools and puzzles and things like that. But the whole English language has been transcribed. There's 120,000 words that are in Chinese characters. And so I built it to be a tool, as well as to be these kind of conceptual art installations that are built in the technology of the Song dynasty 1,000 years ago, because the idea is 1,000 years old, but it does require algorithms to do the complex lifting to actually resequence two languages at scale. Mm-hmm. So without modern tech, it wouldn't have been possible. So this guy couldn't have done it, as it were, because there wasn't enough computational power in his day to be able to really do that. English is a very complicated phonological system, but it took like 2 seconds,
Yeah.
right, with a computer to,
Yeah.
you know, with the proper code to do it. So there it is. But yeah, it's possible, you know.
Kids, do
Will-
try this at home.
Will you translate that fantasy? Can you remind us of the name of it for
Yeah.
those who have
Mhm.
access to it in the Chinese?
I will type
Are
it
you
in
going
here.
to translate
Yeah.
that? Because
I
it
just
sounds
did.
like you need to, but someone might need to incentivize it, so to speak.
Yeah, I actually have worked on the chapter of the forked tongue people, or the split tongue people. Man, it's going to be a while, but I did work and, you know, with a co-translator to start redoing it. The English version of the book is quite lovely. Actually, it's quite well done, but it is radically abbreviated. I really wanted to have all those tables and see it. It's a marvelous idea, and it's a marvelous novel.
Thanks so much for sharing that with us.
Thank you so much for the question. That was sweet of you.
All right. Mhm.
No, I just I was thinking about the changing of the malleability of languages too, because when I was translating, I found that some characters didn't exist as I thought they would, and it turned out they had gotten lost in the translation into computer coded language. And so some characters they can only do by letterpress, but I can't type it into my computer. So it's shifting really right in front of our eyes.
You know, I really enjoyed listening to your answer about the graphic systems, and that way in which I think is, you know, it was true in other languages, but particularly true in Japanese. And I think, as you articulated it, particularly true in a diasporic Japanese language body, to be, you know, to be able to read what a word means, have a signified, but not be able to articulate the signifier, in sound, in a discrete way that you feel, you know, comfortable nailing, right? So this sort of Sino-Japanese, and I love, you know, this is one of the things that I think Chinese characters have this great trans-Pacific imaginary, that there's this writing system that can transcend sound, you know, and beam us, you know, a kind of signified skipping over the sound, right? And I think it isn't true, but that is true in the sense it's not Chinese, right? And maybe also true, and I love what you were saying, because it's also true that it may not necessarily either be Japanese, you know, that one can still, in fact, get it. And, and I just hope that we can also see that because of the ways that the rhyming world of Chinese poetry also created another imaginary where all of this exists in a world of sound that no one has spoken with their mouth, but is in heaven, that articulates what a rhyme is, and that we can do it in Vietnamese, Korean, Japanese, or English. And I think that is a really unusual and lesser known quality of the Chinese imaginary, for a Chinese writing system imaginary, that these sounds inside.
Yeah.
Yeah. I just feel the need to add in for the TV audience that rhyme has tremendous cognitive powers in classical Chinese too, because since there wasn't an ABC, right, language has to be organized for reference works and the like. And how do you do it? Well, you do it by rhymes, right? You know, a word, you know, if you're looking for a word that means something involving metal and a mountain and it rhymes with club, all right, you know, that's enough. That should be enough to help you find it. And whole huge reference works are organized on this system, which, you know, became very natural to people after decades of using it. And these reference works are fascinating to spend time with. You know, the Peiyuan Yunfu, for example, which gives you not only rhymes, but also appropriate topoi for every imaginable kind of poem. It's just a magnificent thing to wander around in. So,
yeah,
okay.
I I love this idea that poetry is not about self-expression or about, just being able to express an idea even at all, let alone self-expression, but instead you come to language to discover it, to explore it. The forests of Chinese and Japanese poetry manuals, language is this materiality. We are, in some sense, alchemists that test different combinations to see what, vertical and horizontal, and we just don't take the idea that it's subordinate to the world, but that it is absolutely a part of it. And it follows the same natural rules as the rest of the world. So it must be balanced for it to be healthy, must be this and that, have categories of resonance, like the 5 categories so it is a material,
Yeah.
it is not a description of material. It is material. And I think that's a really big difference between, the Chinese poetry and the Japanese Chinese poetry, the Sino-Japanese poetry in English.
Right. And to bring us back to the theme of adventure that we started with, it's a situation in which writing poetry is a matter of discovering linguistic resources. Yeah, you're wandering around the landscape, seeing what you can access. Now, well, I want to thank you for giving us a tremendously exciting and inspiring view of your studios. This is just the best possible studio tour. And I encourage everyone to read the writings and translations and software projects and performances of these two, and to, as the gospel says, go forth and do likewise. Continue adventuring.
Thanks
Thank you
so
very much.
Thank you.
And I want to
Swaku,
just,
thank you.
Thank you.
and
Jen, thank
before
you.
we,
Han, thank you so much. And all the
Thank
students,
you.
thanks for reading the work.
Before we sign off, I want to remind everyone that the final event for our series will take place 1 week from today at the same time, 6 p.m. Central Standard Time. And it features John Keane. He's going to give a lecture called Napoleon Rivers, Black Studies and Translation as Anti-Racist Activism. Please tune in for that final event. And this just has been so rich. I feel really privileged to be able to be a fly on the wall with you three in conversation.
Thanks to everyone for being here tonight. Thanks especially to Sawako and Jonathan. Good night.